let me put a big disclaimer on Psalm 23 before we begin. Psalm 23 is not the summary of David's life. If you're interested, and if you like kicks and giggles, read Psalm 13. Psalm 13, it appears as if there are times in David's life where he was in the valley of the shadow of death, and he did not think God was with him. Because then he writes a psalm like Psalm 13. But there were times in his life where he has this experience in life, moving, talking, breathing, experiencing life, and yet he feels this sense that God is his shepherd. And so the question is, what can we learn from David's experience, David's roller coaster life, that he's in this moment where he's in tune with, walking step by step with God as he talks in Psalm 23. There are some pretty crazy things that are said in Psalm 23, and it kind of relates to this idea of being satisfied, or this idea really just being satisfied. For me in my life, I am never, ever satisfied. I'm just not. I'm never satisfied with anything. Whether it be food, whether it be sleep, whether it be accomplishments, or whether it be experiences, I am never, ever satisfied. I'm the worst person to take a vacation with. Because the food wasn't good enough, the roller coasters weren't fast enough, whatever it was, I just walk away and I'm like, I just thought it was going to be more. Now, give me credit, I feel like the reason that happens to me is because I'm very optimistic. And when the thing finally comes that I was so optimistic about, and it wasn't great, then at that moment I'm going, oh, that's just me. And as it relates to food, I want to eat food all day long. I'm the guy who picks up the Krispy Kreme donuts now, okay? And I've eaten breakfast, I hop in the car, and yet I put those donuts in my car, and I want to eat again. In fact, this morning, and I'm very disciplined, but this morning as I was putting the donuts on the tray to put those out, I grabbed one hot Krispy Kreme and took the biggest bite of it I possibly could, stashed it in my office, and then came in here. Because I'm never satisfied with food. I always want to eat more, and I always want it to be a little bit better, hotter, whatever it may be. That's just me. Sleep, oh my goodness. Especially now that I have a child, sleep just seems to be so elusive. Right now, if you just dimmed the lights and said it's nap time, I'd be the first person out and probably snoring. I could sleep anywhere, everywhere, except on an airplane, and even then I'm not satisfied with those seats. That's just me. I'm not satisfied. And when it comes to accomplishments, boy, is that me. I've said 2 times to Amanda, if I get this job, or if I get this job promotion, we are celebrating. We are going to go out, we're going to just waste money on food, it's going to be great. Then we get something good happens, the job comes, and then all of a sudden I'm like, no, we got things to do. We don't have time to celebrate. And we're right on to the next thing, trying to accomplish the next thing, trying to take on the next challenge, and the best part is, Amanda's the same way. So it's okay. She's not upset with me. If you think she is, she's not, because she's the same way. And we just go, 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 go. Yesterday, she is the same way. Yesterday I was hit with a to-do list as we moved into a new house, and she's never satisfied with the house the way it is. Neither am I, but I really don't want to do that all day when there's college football on. And so that's kind of the way that's been going between the two of us, is we're just never satisfied with the way things are. That's the problem for me in life. Not only that, though, as it relates to experiences, I'm that person where I know I go too much, I make myself too busy, so there are particular Saturdays where I tell myself I'm not leaving the house today. I just don't. I don't have anything I need to do. I'm staying in the house. And by 11 a.m., I can't stand it anymore. And I've got to go somewhere. I've got to do something. I've got to see somebody, because I'm not satisfied with doing nothing. I'm not satisfied with not experiencing something new, something that I could be experiencing, because it's Saturday and I don't have to work that day. And so that's just been my experience, is that I'm just never satisfied. Now, human beings are this way. Human beings are this way. It's the reason that people have more clothes than they need. Come on. Don't lie to me. Even if you haven't bought clothes in 2 years, it's probably because you can't fit new clothes in your closet, right? That's just the way it is. It's the reason that we have an excess amount of canned food, potentially, or an excess amount of whatever it may be. That's just how human beings are. We're just never satisfied. You give someone a little bit of extra money, and they want to spend it. Why? Right? They're not going to the store and going, oh man, I desperately need this. It's like, oh, I kind of want that. Right? That's what people do. That's what human beings do. On top of that, there's the human phenomenon. I've mentioned it before, but it's just so funny to me. Boredom. Why can't you and I sit for 2 hours and stare at a white wall and do nothing? Why not? Why would that drive you crazy? Why would it drive you crazy to sit still and do nothing? And I don't mean sit and sew, and I don't mean do your woodwork or do your hobby or what. I just mean sit, no noise, no music, nothing, and just sit there. You can't do it. And I love it when you watch people who go to the beach. They go to the beach to do nothing, but yet, right, as you start to see, like, the beach is invaded with things to do, you know? You got to have the jet ski ride. You got to have a book to read. Like, human beings need something to do. Why? Human beings are never, ever satisfied. They're just not. You can't do it. Now, I think that was the way God created us, because human beings, could you imagine if we weren't that way? Like, just how ridiculously, like, nothing would get done and nothing would be accomplished if there wasn't some sense of that inside of us. I think it has to do with some type of survival instinct or whatever it is. I'm not here to talk about that, but I am here to just talk about this idea that human beings aren't really ever satisfied. And I think that potentially you can relate to that, because I know for sure I can relate to that. I'm much more guilty of that than probably most people. Because for me, even though I have many things, I feel like I lack many things. But yet there's this statement in Psalm 23 that just drives me nuts. There's this guy in the Bible that said something shocking, something stunning, surprising, and staggering. He said something that I'm not sure that I believe based on everything I just said. In fact, I'd be sure I didn't believe him. I would just call him a liar if it wasn't for the fact that it's in the Bible. And because it's in the Bible, I feel like I have to stop and I have to think about it and see if it's possible for somebody to make this statement. And David, this normal human being with survival instincts, discovery instincts, conquering instincts, like you and me, he said this in Psalm 23. He said, I lack nothing. Now, don't just treat this like the Bible, like most Christians do, and go, amen. No, think about it. He said, I lack nothing. What's wrong with him? If I walked in here today and I said, well, amen, like if we walked around during the greet time and people were like, and I was like, what's your prayer request? And they say, well, I've got this really heavy prayer request, and they go on to describe it. They say, what's yours? And I said, I lack nothing. See, it sounds arrogant, does it not? Like, it sounds horribly arrogant, because the only people I know, there's really only two people I know that make the claim that they lack nothing. The first is a really rich snob who's just trying to emphasize how rich they are. That's the first person that I would think of that would say, I lack nothing. The other one is a Buddhist, okay? Because Buddhists say the greatest wealth in life is contentment. And there's a slogan or expression like that. So for me, this phrase in the Bible, I feel like either a rich snob hijacked the Bible or a Buddhist crept in when no one was looking. And there's this sense of, I lack nothing. And I'm telling you, I can't relate to that. I just can't. I lack everything. Even though I can count my blessings, I do it all the time. I mean, I wake up in the morning and I thank God for health. When I go to bed at night, I find myself in this mysterious wonder of, like, how can life be good like that? How can, you know what I mean? How can I have family and friends? I do those things. But the moment I'm done with that, it's right back to what's not done, what needs to be accomplished, what more do I need to be, should I experience, and that itch and that instinct of go, go, go creeps up. And then I feel like I lack everything. And then in that moment, I read something like Psalm 23:1, and it's where David says, I lack nothing. And I go, you are a liar. That's what I think. If I'm just honest about what I think, when I read Psalm 23:1, I go, I don't know about that. Like, are you just saying things? Because I wonder. You guys know church people. Church people just say things. You know? They can be going through a terrible time. You know it's awful. And you saw them when they pulled in the parking lot. They were mad because there's just too much stress on that family. Then you get them in the lobby and you say, hey, good morning, and they go, hey. Right? Because church folk just say things. So I just wonder, as I look at Psalm 23, is he just saying this? Like, did David just like, well, I'm the king of Israel, I got to write something good? Like, what? Or, on the flip side, he meant this. And you see, if he didn't mean what he's saying, I'm not scared. If he did mean this, and this came straight from his experience of God, well, then I'm scared, because I feel like there's a gap between my experience and his experience. I don't know, right? There just seems to be that way. And by the way, there seems to be a gap in what David says in Psalm 23 and anything and everything I hear in Christianity today about God. Many people talk and will make the statement, the Lord's my shepherd. I have no lack. But in all reality, in their minds, in their opinions, primarily God is their dictator. I shall not do wrong. Like, that would be what they say. The Lord is my police. I won't get away with anything. Like, that's the way that people think about God. They don't think about God as a shepherd, and therefore they would lack nothing. They think about God in all of these other different ways. Or, in some churches, the Lord is my genie in a bottle, right? The Lord's my genie in a bottle. And all I have to do is ask him for something, and I'll get whatever I want, provided I put enough money in the offering plate. I'll get anything and everything that I want. Because I can't outgive God. So give it on back, God. Now's that time. I want it and I need it, right? God's my genie in a bottle. And so that's what I mean. Like, Psalm 23 should be something that grabs all of our attentions and compels us to think through this experience that he had and the things that he goes on to say in verse 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 in question, what was this experience that David had that would cause him to say, I lack nothing? The funny thing to me about all of this is that this is King David. That's another thing I'm skeptical of. We are King David. Of course you lack nothing. I mean, look at yourself compared to everybody else. You're a king. But at the same time, right, we all know that kings still have great insecurities. The kings still have huge problems. And a lot of kings never stop trying to conquer. And so even though I would try to negate or take away from this statement of David's and say, well, you're a king, of course you'd say that, it doesn't explain it. There's something mysterious about Psalm 23:1. And I want you to see it in the mystery that a human being can make the statement, I don't have lack. And if he's sincere and if he's genuine, which I'm assuming he is, that is something that while many church people say it, it's not what many church people actually feel and actually believe. So as a church, as we look at Psalm 23 and verse 1, I just want us today to dwell on this concept of what David is talking about when he says, I lack nothing. The interesting thing about what he says when he says, I lack nothing, he doesn't say he lacks nothing because he looks out in his kingdom and he counts his servants and he counts his armies. And that's not what he does. It's not that David counts his resources either. What David does is he looks to one thing and says, because of that, I lack nothing. And what he's talking about is the type of relationship that he had with God Almighty. And it wasn't the relationship of as God as dictator or God as police or God as genie in a bottle. It was simply a nuanced way to look at God that most people didn't think of when they thought about their God. Not in this day. And though many people say it today, it's just not what people do. But he looked at the relationship as that of shepherd. When David measured his life for deficiencies, shortages, or lack, he didn't look at what he owned or what resources were available. He didn't check his bank account or his retirement account. He checked his relationship with the Almighty, the generous God of earth, and found peace in his connection to the Almighty, the generous and benevolent God of earth. And in the peace of his relationship, he could confirm, I lack nothing. So get it. His sufficiency wasn't tied to his resources. It was tied to his source. The source was God himself. His sufficiency wasn't tied to his meditation or mental health. Now that's interesting too. Because so oftentimes for me, the way that I try to arrive at a point where I feel like I lack nothing is to kind of meditate or to count my blessings. That's not what David's formula. David's formula is, I know God, He's my shepherd, therefore I don't have lack. He didn't sit around and count his blessings. He simply talks about the way the relationship with God works and why that gives him a peace and a sense that everything's okay and that he has everything that he could possibly need. So it's interesting, though, because like I said, many people have different experiences with God. And today, I'm telling you, when you go into more traditional conservative churches, what you're going to find is that their relationship with God is one of a police kind of figure or a dictator. And you don't cross that dictator or else things go wrong for you. Don't you watch that. Don't say that. You better give that or else God will come after you. See, that's not a shepherd. But on the other side of kind of church experience, you've got this idea that just do anything, be everything you want to, and God will love you. And the truth is that God is a loving God 100%. I think God is love. I think that's his strongest attribute. However, God does not love people that he doesn't endorse people that take advantage of other people, that hurt people, that rob people, that rape people. That is not God either. And so there's this understanding, though, of this, just to me, you've got all these different experiences, and the one that seems to be the one that manifests itself, and I'll point this out in just a few seconds, through the Bible is this idea of the fact that God is a shepherd. He's a shepherd of individuals, and he's a shepherd of the whole earth. Unless you lived 2,000 years ago, the problem with Psalm 23 is that unless you lived 2,000 years ago, or unless you've lived in extremely remote areas in Idaho, Romania, India, or other countries, you've never seen the relationship between a sheep and a shepherd. And even if I tried to show you like a video of a sheep and a shepherd, or if I tried to tell you about that, it wouldn't mean a whole lot to you, I don't think. Because I watched videos this past week of sheep and shepherd, and I was like, doesn't do anything for me. And I read about it, and I was like, to explain that would take hours. So to me, to cut to the chase, I think the best way to picture this relationship is the other word for God that comes up in the Bible. And it's not the word shepherd, but it's very, very similar, and it's the word father. To me, that's the best way to think about it. Because think about it, sheep are ignorant and frail, just like young children. Right? Sheep are ignorant and frail just like young children. And the way that a shepherd takes care of sheep is the same way that a father has to take care of a 1, 2, or 3-year-old. And while we could talk about this relationship from the perspective of the shepherd, Psalm 23 demands that we think about this relationship from the perspective of the sheep, meaning, in this example, the child. Have you ever heard somebody say, ignorance is bliss? I'm trying to get at the heart of what Psalm 23:1 is saying. And I think it relates to the idea that ignorance is bliss. Because it's so true. When I didn't know anything about cancer, and I didn't know anyone with cancer, I never feared getting cancer. That ignorance, for me, was bliss. When I didn't know anything about terrorism, and I had never seen terrorist acts, I never feared terrorism. Ignorance is bliss. And there's no more ignorant person in this world than a young child. There's no one that lives a more blissful life as a result than a child. I've been reminded of the blissfulness of childhood by watching my son. Because, right, when you have your first kid, everybody knows it changes everything. And one of the things that it's just done for me in watching him is made me want to go back to being a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old. I know I said a couple of weeks ago I never wanted to go back, but I'm telling you I'm starting to change my mind because this kid lives a blissful life. And it's because he's completely ignorant. He has nothing to worry about. That kid wakes up, he makes funny shrieking noises until we come get him. He eats, he plays, and then he sleeps. That sounds good. then, when he wakes up from that nap, he makes funny noises again until we come get him. Then he eats, and he plays, and then he takes another nap. You know, I've sat there, I've watched him in the way that he falls asleep, and I'm like, man, if adults could fall asleep like that, you know what I mean? Just kind of like, oh, I just want to play. Oh, well, right? And then fall asleep. But like you can't sleep and I can't sleep because we're thinking about what's the next thing we have to do. How, right? Where's the money going to come from for this or that? How are we ever going to, what are people going to think of me about this if I don't do that? And all of these different pressures and things that weigh on us, right? Because ignorance for a child is so much bliss. It's so much bliss. I remember, I literally think back on my life, and I think about the times when I didn't know about the reality of this. The reality of certain evils that are in the world, or, like I said previously, about cancer and different things. And I think about before I fully understood how all that worked and how blissful life was. I remember the first time I knew a completely healthy person who didn't smoke cigarettes and didn't do anything to really harm their health who got cancer. And I thought, wait, that doesn't happen, does it? That can't happen, can it? See, children don't fully understand that. And as a result, they live a very blissful, worry-free life. See, Judson isn't interested in the news or the stock market. Instead, he loves dogs and opening up the kitchen cabinets. Great day for him. If a dog flashes on the TV, because it's never flashing in our house, let me tell you that. It flashes on the TV, and if you can open up the kitchen cabinets. And watching him reminds me of the joy of being a child, where you're not worried about losing your job, losing your health, losing a loved one, or losing anything. And as a child, you're not worried about catching the bus, getting to work, or paying bills. Somehow, some way, that stuff just happens, and maybe in his mind, houses are just there for anybody to live in, whichever one they want, as long as no one's living in it first, right? I don't know how he thinks about those things, but for him, it just happens. And so there's nothing to stress about, fret about, fuss about, or worry about. And if you stop and think about what David says here in Psalm 23, it can be hard to really pin it down, but I think what David is talking about regarding his relationship with God, it's that kind of relationship that is like that of a small child and his father or his mother. It's that stage in life where you can't worry about anything because you don't know what to worry about. And your father and mother take care of all those things. So for you, life is all about slides and swings and stuffed animals and coloring and giggling and eating. Sounds like a good life. And here's the thing that's so interesting. David is saying that in his experience with God, out of all of the pressures that are on him, of all the people that potentially want to cut his head off, the potential of war for the nation that he's trying to protect, somehow he's able to put all of that away and say, I'm not the shepherd of my nation. Somehow he believes that it's not him. And by the way, sometimes our stress is egotistical, is it not? That we control the future, that we control everything in life, and that it's all up to me. And so David was somehow able to dissect what his responsibility was versus what God's responsibility was, and rest in the relationship that he had with the Almighty. And then stop and say, I find rest in that relationship. Because in my opinion, and in my, not just in my opinion, and not just in my mind, because I'm telling you, in my opinion and in my mind, I can say, the Lord's my shepherd, I have no lack. But that's not down in my stress levels, right? That's not down in my fears. But somehow it was there for this king who had more stress and more responsibility on his shoulders than every single one of us in this room combined. And he got to the point where he understood that, and he could say that as his experience. As I go back and I think about this relationship again, I have to talk more about a child with their parents, like Judson with me, because it's much easier, like I said, than talk about a sheep and a shepherd. But I think for Judson, if he was writing Psalm 23, the way that he would write verse 1 would be like this. Darren is my daddy, I lack nothing. And if he wrote that, you bet your life I'd be a proud father. But right, he's not going to, because he still doesn't see it in that depth. But that would be it. Darren is my dad. Darren is my father. I lack nothing. And it's true. Because as long as I'm healthy and I'm alive, he will never lack anything. I won't let him lack anything. Because as long as I'm healthy and as long as I'm alive, I am his shepherd. And the relationship of father and shepherd is one that the Bible and one that Jesus continuously highlights throughout Scripture. And I think it makes sense. And I think it's so important for us as we think about Psalm 23 and we think of the shepherd relationship of God, that remember that God is the father of his creation. And when we think about it in the sense of father, because we're much more closely attached to that. Now, maybe you weren't in your own personal life growing up, but maybe you've seen it in the way that you've been able to shepherd and care for your own children. But in that sense, it's so important to think about it this way, because if you think about it in the New Testament, when Jesus wanted or had an opportunity to give a metaphor about how his disciples should think about the God of the universe, what was the metaphor that he gave them? When they said, teach us to pray, Jesus said, okay, pray this way. Our Father, right, who's in heaven, holy is your name. And he goes on from there through the Lord's Prayer. And the metaphor that he wants to give is one of that relationship of a father. And Jesus specifically, after the Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6, he goes on to talk about this relationship of father. And these words in the New Testament relate so well to the words of Psalm 23 in the Old Testament. And in Matthew 6, verse 25, this is what Jesus said. He says, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink. Right there I'm guilty. I worry about everything about what I'll eat and drink, because I just feel like that's guaranteed. But I worry about stupid things, So for me, you want to talk about one of the passages of Scripture where I am living like a pagan. It's this one. Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life. And I always, by the way, can you tell this is personal for me? For me, with this passage, I'm always like, well, that's for people who, they worry about too much. But my goodness, worrying about food or drink, I worry about every little thing as opposed to food and drink. Right? It's so much more than that for me. Like, I could crush you in a worrying competition. I'd win that every day if you stacked my worries versus your worries side by side. So he goes on, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat and drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns. And yet your heavenly what? Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? Verse 28 of Matthew 6 says this. He kind of reintroduces the thought, says the same thing. He says, and why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. It's funny that Solomon is mentioned here. Because how is Solomon related to David? Right? Yeah, it's his son. And so in this moment, we have a king who potentially heard his father, who was a king, say, the Lord's my shepherd. God has taken care of me. And then you've got Jesus now referencing his son and saying, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? And when he ends it with something that just should crush you, as it crushes me. He says in verse 32, for the pagans, for the people who don't know God and don't follow God and don't have any connection to God, the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. You know how many times I have heard pastors talk about the materialism and the greed and the want and the want and the want of Americans, and talk about Americans are so greedy, and they're just living pagan lifestyles because all they worry about is new cars, new clothes. And I'm like, no, pagans worry about food and drink too. That's what Jesus said. Right? So bring it a little closer home. And what it is, it's not just worrying and wanting for all of those things. It's, in Jesus' mind, it's not valuing God enough to see him as your shepherd. And he says someone who doesn't see that tomorrow will be handled and taken care of by God, that person's a pagan. That is so strong. Because I could probably think about most of you, and if you worried yesterday, you're a pagan. Right? See, this is why Jesus had problems with some likability among religious folk who thought that they were the most religious that there was. See, Jesus calls me a pagan in Matthew 6. Like, I'm a pagan. I should get a t-shirt and wear it. I'm a pagan. But on the back it would say, and so are you. Because it's just how we live. And he goes on in Matthew 7. The Lord is my shepherd. He says, I lack nothing in Psalm 23. But this idea of shepherd father comes up in Matthew 7 and verse 9, which says, which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone, or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? Now, I think the reason I love that is because what that does for me is makes me realize if you want to understand this relationship, think about your relationship and the care and the protection that you provide or provided for your own children or your nieces, nephews, or children that you've taken care of. Think about the way you take care of them. And now, as you think about that relationship, to understand the way that you're related to God, think also about how odd it would be if your children lived the way that you live in relation to God. Let me give you an example. Okay, right here. So, Judson, going back to this relationship with Judson. Judson doesn't worry about tomorrow. He doesn't worry about the next 5 minutes, let alone tomorrow. I don't even think he has a concept of what tomorrow is. I'm telling you, I believe that kid falls asleep, he wakes up, and he's like, what happened? Why aren't we playing? Well, he doesn't even have a concept of days. I think he just feels like he drifts out. I feel like he doesn't even think he sleeps. I'm dead serious. Because when he goes to sleep like this. Like screaming, crying, and then just like a second later, he's out. And don't get me wrong, he can cry for a long time. But he never calms down. And then when he wakes up, he's like fighting to move and play and do something. And it just makes me like, I almost just want to say, like, do you realize you were asleep for 10 hours? I don't even think you do. So the funny thing is, he doesn't worry about tomorrow because I don't even think he understands that there is tomorrow and there's 2 different days that he just gapped. Okay, point is this. He also doesn't worry about just things about tomorrow. And the way that I know this is because Judson has never ended a meal by asking me for more food or more water or more milk, only to pick up that food and milk and hide it in his bedroom. How weird would that be? Think about it. If like you came into his room and like you're like, I know I set that $10 bill somewhere, and a 14-month-old's like, I got it. Right? Because he's like storing up food. And he's storing up milk, and he's storing up cash for when he needs it. That would be super, super weird. And Jesus is kind of saying, like, that's kind of how I feel. That's kind of how the God of heaven and earth feels when he sees us live that way. And that's where the Psalm 23 thing comes back up. Where there was a human being on earth with more stress and more responsibility than you or I will ever have. Unless you become the President of the United States. Not saying you won't, just saying. More pressure and more responsibility than you've ever had, and yet that person could say, I lack nothing. Because remember, David was not just a rich aristocrat living on Miami Beach. He was a king in a barbaric world with constant threats from here and there. And even his own people were a little crazy. And yet he says, I lack nothing. So as a pastor, I must admit, I don't understand what Jesus meant in Matthew 6 when he said, don't worry. I just don't even know how that's possible. Like, should we not save money? You know? Like what does this mean? Like, what does it all mean? Because all I do is worry. All I do is play out the future in my mind to determine what could go wrong, when, and if, and then devise a plan, if and when that happens, what I'll do. And for that reason, I just don't have any concept of Psalm 23:1, somebody making a statement, I lack nothing. And so the question to all of us is this question about that statement. And I challenge you before I ask the question, don't just be a church person and say, of course. Ask the question. Is it in your mind, is it in the way that you think about the future that you can say, I don't have any lack? Because of my connection, because of the way that I'm related to the God of earth. Like, is that the way you live? Now, here, let me say this. What's really striking to me about this, if this was just in the Psalms, I don't know if I think about the Bible wrong or not, but I'm just saying, if this was in the Psalms, I'd be like, I kind of want to go back to what Jesus said. Because Jesus was the one who defied corrupted governments. Jesus was the one who created public demonstrations to get people back on track. And Jesus was the one who went out to restore societies and bring back outcasts. That's the Jesus that I'm just so compelled by. But it's that same Jesus that we read about in the Gospels that comes to us in Matthew 6 and says, why do you think so long and hard about tomorrow? Stop it. Cut it out. You think you have so much that you're missing out on and that you lack, but I'm telling you, you don't. Not because of the resources that you have, because of the source for all of those things. And if you seek after all these things and those things preoccupy your mind, then you are no better than the pagans. And your connection and relationship to the God of earth has done nothing to change that facet of your life. And for that reason, you are acting like a pagan. See, I'm like, Jesus, come on. Let's worry about corrupted governments. Let's worry about people who are starving. Let's talk about those things. And Jesus goes, but you'll never have the longevity that you need to have in life and the freedom of this blissful life to get to that point. If you don't get to that point, you'll never have the energy. You'll never be able to give yourself fully to the kind of things that I need to give you to. I have to fix you first before I can fix the world through you. And boy, that makes sense for me. Because I can get so preoccupied with what I need that I completely forget about what you need or what somebody halfway around the world needs. So all of this relates and fits in perfectly with the Jesus that we know in the Gospels. But I just wonder how close that we can possibly get as Western Americans living in the most prosperous country, one of the most prosperous countries on the planet. Can we get there? Will we ever know what it's like to be able to rely upon and hope in God? Not in my resources, but in my source. I don't know. But I want to see how close we can get. And I think Psalm 23 will bring us to our attentions and make us consider, can we say, I have no lack? Or I lack nothing. And can we take the way that all of us as individuals potentially experience and relate to God, whether we relate to him as a genie in a bottle that will just answer anything and everything we need and want, and we'll get mad at him if he doesn't give it to us, or like a police officer, and we'll look over our shoulder, we'll be afraid that if we step out of line, he's going to hit us with lightning, or that he's going to make our car break down. My car broke down because I didn't do this for God. Or can we all come around this central thought that God is a shepherd, the shepherd of humanity, but your shepherd as well. Human beings are never satisfied. Whether it's food, sleep, accomplishments, or experiences, nothing is ever enough. And I'm not sure if it's a survival instinct, a discovery instinct, or some conquering instinct, but human beings are never satisfied. We always want more friends, more money, more accomplishments, more admiration, more possessions, just more. But there's something that we can all tap into. There's a possibility that flickers to me in Psalm 23. I want to figure out what that is, and I want to figure out that with you. And so that's what we'll be doing today, kicking off in our breakout sessions. Before we make our way to those breakout sessions, let's pray. Ask for God to work this into our hearts, into our lives, to show us what needs to change about the way that we live in order to get around to that. And let's ask him to kind of be the voice today that we need, that was that voice of Jesus speaking straight to people and saying, you're just like a pagan if you worry about what you're going to eat and what you're going to drink. Let's pray. Father, there is a possibility of humanity and a possibility for life that we see flicker here in Psalm 23. And I ask that that flicker of a reality could become a reality for at least one person in this room, if not 10, if not 20, if not all of us. And let us, over the next 6 weeks, think about what David had found in this moment that potentially we've never experienced or that we have experienced but we've let go of. Help us to go back to living with the faith of a child, in trusting in you to provide the next step, to be there for the next thing. And may Psalm 23 gut out and renovate our hearts that are desperate for something else or something more. And may it lead us to great contentment. And may it lead us to great inner peace, and really just peace in general that could spread throughout the whole earth. And then, Father, I pray that we would be people who would live out that inner peace into the rest of the world and be able to bless the world because of our contentment. Because that's the way it works and that's the way it happens. And God, we will be ineffective if we can't master these words of Matthew 6 and Psalm 23. I ask these things through Jesus. Amen. I'm going to butcher who said this, but I think it's such a great quote. And I just want to draw the big picture of how all of this ties together. It was either Gandhi or it was Buddha who said this. I know I'm off by a long time here, but here's the quote. I love this quote. And if you Google it, you can find it. And by the way, just so you know, I think there's a way the world works. I think Jesus knows what it is. And I think sometimes other religions or other perspectives can touch it. You know what I mean? They can be right on that because truth is the way the world works. So if you live in the world, you kind of start to run across truth, right? Through experience. So I think it's okay to sometimes consider, right? Otherwise you're going to be like, our pastor's quoting Buddhism. So let me just kind of give the quote. It's a good quote. The world has enough for everyone's need, but it will never have enough for everyone's greed. I think it's a great quote. But I think, do you see the connection between Psalm 23 and Matthew 6 to all of this? That if God can't calm down your desires, your wants, your greed, things that you're worrying about that really just don't relate to just bare necessities of life, if God can't calm that down, then you're just as much of a problem as what the world's plagued by. And so that's how all of this relates, because if God can put peace in your heart, then he can bring peace to earth. And that's how all of this kind of comes together. Because the world can never support everyone's greed, but it absolutely has the resources to support everyone's need. And that's where we need to get to, but we can only get there through the bottleneck of Psalm 23 and Matthew 6. So I look forward to the breakout sessions. I look forward to hearing your